Welcome to the Liberty Insider. This is a program bringing you information and updates on religious liberty developments in the US and around the world. My name is Lincoln Steed, editor of Liberty magazine, and my guest on this program is Tina Ramirez, founder and president of Hardwired, which is doing a fantastic work for religious freedom in many countries, but particularly in the Middle East and Iraq. But let's talk about a country nearby, because Syria has been in the news for quite a while, hasn't it? And yet, by my lights, with all of the political scandals locally in the US, there hasn't been much talk of Syria in the US, at least till or since the president fired off, how many, 50 cruise missiles?
Yeah.
But what's happening in Syria? It seems to me religion is a big part of the story, isn't it?
Yeah, I think religion's been a part of Syria's story for a long time, but it's kind of been under wraps. I mean, you don't hear much about it. So just as background, thank you, Lincoln, for having me here with you today.
Always a pleasure.
Yeah, and Hardwired, for your viewers, is an organization that provides education and training around the world in religious freedom. So we establish leaders in countries where there's none. So Syria and Iraq would be great examples of that. And to try to turn the tide against religious persecution. And I actually was in Syria, what was it, 2010, I think? So right before the Civil War, I was able to travel with the current patriarch of the Syriac Church, Mor Ephraim, all through Syria and then into Turkey, where their seminary, the Mor Gabriel Monastery, is. That the Turkish government,
about that at the time.
Yeah, the Turkish government's actually trying to take over their main seminary. They claim that it was built on top of a mosque, which is silly, since we know the Syriacs predated them by about 600 or 700 years. But you know, yeah.
So did you see signs of the soon-to-develop civil war when you were there? Was it obvious something was about to happen?
No, I don't think it was. I mean, he had a really tight control on the country at the time, and we had security guards that would be on the plane, like sitting behind us, poking their heads through our seats. And you know, it's kind of funny because, I mean, you know that they're listening. You might as well just join in the conversation. But very tight controls on the whole country. So it was very safe. You never felt like there was anything. Any danger. And unfortunately, in a lot of dictatorships, that's pretty much the way it is. It's really safe to go around there. Yeah. You know, if you're somebody like me that meets with religious communities and tries to understand what's happening. But when we were there, we did meet the former head of the Syriac Church. And for your viewers that don't know, the Syriac Church is really the oldest church in the world. So it was founded by Thomas, the doubting Thomas in the Bible. He went to the Syriac.
He was supposedly ended up in India, though, didn't he?
Yeah, he went all the way down to India. So you had the Thomas go to establish the Syriac Church in Syria, and then a similar Eastern church in Baghdad. So those are the two really prominent churches for the first 300 or 400 years of Christendom.
I think in the United States and in Australia, for that matter, in the West, it's a better way of putting it. Christians tend to forget that Christianity began in the Middle East. That's its home base.
Yeah, and it really was. It was the missionary sending church for. I mean, long before the Roman Catholic Church really emerged to do that. Not until 1400s or much after. And so it was really the Syriac Church and the Eastern Syrian churches that preserved the Greek language, that interacted with the first Muslim communities in the Middle East, that had these ancient dialogues going on, that were the first Christians to really live as minorities under a Muslim government, where they had to learn to interact. And they had missionaries spread all through China. I mean, in the Mongolian region. So it was a big empire.
It was the era of the Gospel Commission, where they moved on out. Now it's contracting a little, isn't it?
Yeah, now it's contracting. I mean, since the rise of Islam, it really has been contracting. So you've seen, since at least around the year 1000, a major downward spiral in the church, and it became very isolated. And so around the 1500s, many of those Eastern churches actually joined the Catholic Church, but the Syriac Church did not. So that's still separate in Damascus. And when we were there, the former head of the church said to us, he said, "Tina, if what happened in Iraq when Saddam was brought down was to happen here with Assad, we will not survive as a church." And so that was just before the Civil War, but he was very right. And I think that for everybody that's watched the news, you've seen how the Christian church in Iraq was really decimated after the fall of Saddam. You had a church of 1.4 million go down to about 400,000, and now since ISIS, it's like half.
We talk
only
about
half of the
Syria,
Christians
but
are allowed.
we can
That's Iraq.
divert to Iraq.
But Syria,
But
it's
maybe
the same
you know
thing.
the answer to something. I give talks on religious liberty all the time, and I give some of those same statistics. What I don't know is, yes, it was the Christian population in Iraq was down to about 400,000 recently.
Pre-ISIS, yeah.
Yes, and that's the point. Then ISIS took over Mosul, which is the second largest city in Iraq. There's not that many big cities. I don't know how many Christians were in Mosul, but it had to have been a couple of 100,000, or at least 100,000.
Yeah, surrounding Mosul, you have a lot of Christian villages. And so what happened when they came into Mosul is they also went into dozens of villages that were predominantly Turkmen, Christian, Yazidi. There are a number of different communities.
And they couldn't get away. They were essentially trapped very quickly.
Well, they were given the option. You have 48 hours, you convert or die, and so, or be killed. So those Christian villages, at least 7 or 8 of them in that area around Mosul, were completely wiped out of any Christian
That's what I haven't heard. The number of Christians that were martyred there. It must have been large.
Well, there weren't very many martyred. The Christians actually...
Most of them paid them off.
Well, no, what they did is they fled, so they lost everything. I mean, you had about $7 to $8 billion in assets that the Christian community around Mosul just lost overnight. And then, I mean, they just escaped with their lives, essentially. And but they lost everything. So to rebuild, after they've rebuilt so many times, including after Saddam fell, and then, they'd been moved under Saddam, and then they'd been moved after Saddam, I mean, it's decimated the community. So many of them, instead of trying to try again in Iraq one more time, are deciding to leave. So the numbers, they went down from 1.4 million to 400,000 pre-ISIS, and now I think there's around 200,000 maybe left in the country in total. But it's not that they've been killed. Most of them are living in refugee camps in Jordan, or have fled to the United States.
You're right. I remember reading of one refugee camp in Jordan. I think it was 500,000. Was it 5 or 200,000?
There's
hundreds of thousands, most of them Christians.
Yeah, many refugee camps. So so that situation, the patriarch in Syria saw that if what happened in Iraq.
I'm sure he was right.
And so when Assad was, I mean, it's still an ongoing civil war there, but Assad always protected the Syriac church. And so even when I was there, he used to send his kids to vacation at the area where the Syriac church was. And it's not that the Syriac church was in cahoots with the Assad regime. It's just that they had a good relationship. They were protected under him in the same way that many of the Christian churches were protected under Saddam in Iraq. And I'm
glad you're saying this, because the viewers on this program have probably heard me, and I'll tell the story again. A few years ago, when the unrest first started under the Obama administration, President Obama, in good faith, I'm sure, but acting on his advisors, said very publicly that Assad needed to go. And about that time, they asked a number of us with religious liberty to come down and to talk to the faith-based initiative group, for want of a better term, out of the White House. You know, the group in charge of religious activities. And they wanted to persuade us on something, but after that, the small group that came, there were about 10 or 12 of us, no more, they asked us to give some feedback. And I remember telling them, I said, please tell the president, whenever he gets up and says that Assad should go, that's like a green light in Syria for Muslims mostly to go and attack Christians. Because if you're opposed to Assad, don't like his regime, the soft underbelly of what he stood for was to attack Christians. And it wasn't that he particularly liked Christians, just as in Iraq. The Ba'ath Party, socialist, secular government, had given equal rights to all faiths. And the radical Muslims objected to hear the Christians are being protected. So we saw the same thing. Attacks on Christian churches would follow all of these public denunciations of Assad.
Well, I mean, the Assad regime itself represents a religious minority, the
Yes,
Alawites, and
okay.
so within Islam, and so they obviously need their own protection, and I think that's. You know,
But I think it comes from the Ba'ath Party, not from Assad per se.
it's part of that.
They don't want religion involved in politics. They want,
It's very similar to the Saddam era.
remember, Saddam was in an ongoing violent battle
yeah.
against Islamic fundamentalists.
Yeah, and I think it's definitely a very controversial situation. Do you know, it should Assad
Well, you're
stay
damned
or
if
go?
you do, damned if
Yeah,
you don't.
it's
There was no
kinda-
easy answer, of course.
Yeah, I mean, there's no. I mean, with any of these dictators, it's like I think what Thomas Jefferson said about slavery: you can't keep holding the line, but you can't let him go. And it's
Yeah,
like
that's true.
it's not sustainable.
And you can certainly
But-
make a good argument that the dictatorial regime in both those countries created a situation that eventually
Right.
blossomed the way it has in Syria.
And that's where diplomacy comes in and is so important, and the international arena and how they navigate that. And unfortunately, they just didn't navigate it well. But historically, many of the Christian communities have been protected by Assad, by even Russia, in that region of the world. And so for those communities, they live between a rock and a hard place.
Well, it's worth saying, some of our viewers perhaps try to make some sense of the politics in the world. One of the reasons that Russia, I think, is showing an interest in Syria is because Russia has an Eastern Orthodox
right,
sensibility,
absolutely.
and they are wanting
Yeah.
to protect the religious dynamic there.
Oh, absolutely. I'm sure that is part of it. And we don't know that not Assad is going to be any better. And that's part of the challenge, is that when the civil war began in Syria, you had a lot of diverse democratic movements spring up.
Yeah.
But across the board, they quickly silenced the Christian and the more religious freedom-oriented members of the party. Yeah. And so people like Bassam Ishaq, the Syriac was really not treated well, even by the democracy advocates. And so until those democracy advocates and the opposition that have been meeting in Europe and coming to the United States are really unequivocal about their stance for religious freedom as a red line, I don't know that they should be given that kind of support politically, because they could so easily just turn into the next Assad. And so how do we really know?
Right.
And then the alternative is obviously the different factions of ISIS and other terrorist groups that have been trying to take power within Syria as well, which is very dangerous and something that no one,
and apart from anything else, it is a civil war, and civil wars are never
very messy,
amenable to outside interference anyhow.
Right.
And they're always messy. It's worth remembering, even in the US, there was a civil war here, a massive event that I think in many ways we're still living through the after effects of that.
Yeah, and there's a lot to lose. So there are parts of Syria, though, that haven't been affected, I think, by what we see in the news. It's not a completely decimated, country that's been leveled, but there are parts that have been that are really sad, and it'll take, just years to rebuild. And it is unfortunate because Syria was really, I think, the gem of the Middle East. I've traveled all over the region, and it is by far one of the most beautiful and just nicest countries. But now, sadly, that's hard.
Well, and as you say, I get the distinct impression it's not uniform destruction all over. There are
it's not uniform,
safe pockets of even normalcy.
Yeah.
And parts of Damascus, I think, are still...
Yeah, parts that the government still controls, absolutely.
But I've said it on this program before, but you reminded me, when I was in Israel nearly 2 years ago, they took us up onto the Golan Heights. You could see down the Sea of Galilee.
Yeah.
And it wasn't real clear that day, but they say when it's clear, you can actually see the outskirts of Damascus.
Yeah.
So this is all sort of compacted in together. And the potential to affect other areas and other religious dynamics, even in Israel, very strong. Mm-hmm. We need to take a break. We'll be back shortly. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Liberty Insider. Before the break with guest Tina Ramirez, we were solving the problems of the Middle East and Syria in particular.
Trying.
But recognizing that there's definitely a strong religious component. This is not a secular conflict primarily, is it?
No, and
it might have begun that way.
Right, and I think for a long time, the United States in particular, but a lot of people in the West have miscalculated the religious dimension of the conflict in the Middle East, and in particular in Syria and Iraq. And to really address these recurrent cycles of violence that we see there that are fueling so much terrorism in the world, you can't ignore religious grievances or religious bigotry or extremism, intolerance, fear. You just can't ignore it. It can't be suppressed, and it can't be fueled. And so one of the things that Hardwire does in that region is provide education and training to teach leaders of all different factions, whether they're Muslim Brotherhood leaders, or you name it, across the gamut of religious communities, that there's a space for freedom of religion in order to have a society where you can express your freedom and not live in fear of somebody else taking that freedom away.
And I think it's not just an ideal. That should be the reality of human existence.
Exactly.
But how do you deal in the Middle East? It's, like everywhere else, there's many people that are born into Islam. They don't know a lot about it. They go through the motions and that. But Islam itself, in the Quran and all of the close theological interpretation, insists pretty strongly that the religion is all-encompassing, that there's not a secular state and then the church here. Mm-hmm. So separation of church and state is not just a bad reality with Islam, it really goes to the root of its thinking about reality, doesn't it? How do we deal with that?
We definitely see a trend in the world, and it's not just in Muslim communities, but in Hindu communities and even in some Christian communities across the world, where people associate their identity with their religion.
Ah, yes.
And so then, because this is so tied into their identity, there's a fear of losing your sovereignty as a nation, or your power as a nation, or your identity as a nation, when your religion is threatened, or the dominant religion in a country is threatened. And so we see this fueling a lot of conflict. But ultimately what it comes down to is fear. We see this in America too. Yeah. We have Christian majorities, or not majorities necessarily, but traditionally that have been majorities, that are fearful of losing a position of prominence in the community when the society becomes more secular. And so there's this pendulum that swings of overreacting, and you have to be very careful with that in any country and society, not just in Islamic ones. It's a trend that we see everywhere. And so what we do as Hardwired, when we go in and we work with leaders, diverse leaders, so we bring together in Iraq, for instance, the Christian, the Yazidi, the Baha'i, the atheist, the Zoroastrian, the Muslim. So you've got everyone in the same room. They're all afraid of each other, but somehow they need to learn to live together, to work it out in order to live together, or else they don't have a country. They're just going to descend into constant chaos. And maybe it's gotten
so bad that they have to see that. You're right.
When you hit rock bottom, there's only one way up, which is good. So in Iraq, they've definitely gone there. And what we've seen is amazing, because we see these communities through the training program we do, where we bring them together and they are forced to face their fears of one another, their misconceptions, their prejudices, their bias, and work through those and begin to understand the value of religious freedom for one another, that their rights are tied together, that they can't have the freedom of belief and expression unless you have yours. Even if those two beliefs contradict one another, that there is a right to be wrong in a space, in a public space where freedom exists. And it's amazing that in a society like Iraq, where we see so much conflict, that's actually happening. We have a core group of 25 leaders that are doing amazing things across Iraq to defend religious freedom. We don't even see that here in our country. Mm. So in some ways, it actually brings me hope, because I wish that we could see that in America like we see it in Iraq. And it's not a perfect place or situation, but it's like I shared with you before about the Muslim leader, the Muslim judge, who when ISIS beheaded his youngest brother, said to me, "Tina, this is the fate that awaits every person in Iraq if we don't stand up for religious freedom for everyone."
They're faced with stark choices, there's no question.
Yeah.
And you visited there enough, of course, to be very perceptive on the religious situation. What role does tribal loyalties play into this? Because this is not immaterial to what's happening there. Because people see themselves as a religious community, but also with these tribal identities there, that community can be quite small and definitely marked.
Well, you have tribalism, and then you have just your general, more overarching ethnic loyalties. So the Kurds and the Sunni and the Shia and different.
But like
somewhat
Saddam
different.
was Tikritis, which was largely the semi-tribal community based in Tikrit.
Yeah, in Iraq, I would say that those two dimensions are always. They're always at work. So we actually have three things that are interfacing constantly: the race, the ethnicity, the religion, and so you're always seeing that. But I think at the core of it, without a fundamental baseline of respect for the freedom of conscience of one another, people are constantly living in fear of the motives of the other person in that society, because for generations they've been attacking one another and one group's trying to put assert authority and power over the others, the Shias over the Sunnis, the Turkmen over the Arabs, you name it, the Kurds over whoever. And so until you really address those fears that are underlying a lot of the recurrent cycles of violence, you'll never really get to the root cause of the problem.
I remember on a beach in Bermuda, meeting this fellow and his family, and they said that they'd come from Lebanon, and asked them why they moved and so on. They weren't living in Bermuda, but they were visiting from the US. And he said that I think they were Eastern Orthodox, but they were Christians. It got so bad that when they sent the kids off to school, they'd get on the bus and the bus driver would ask them their names. Now they could tell instantly from their names
right,
they were
where
Christians.
they're from.
And he said that made us fearful. What would happen to our children on the way to school? They've been identified clearly. So that's the level of suspicion and fear in some of those countries.
Well, Saddam fueled that.
Lebanon's been through the civil wars in our lifetime too.
Yeah, and one of the things that we've seen, like in Lebanon, for instance, is when we're working with teachers there, is that they often say, well, we have great freedom. We all just live separately. So the Christians live here and the Druze live here. But living separately is not. It's not freedom. It means that you're not actively engaging one another because you're afraid of one another still. Yeah. And fear can be one of the greatest factors to cause conflict. And so unless you really address that, it's going to recur. And a lot of people probably don't know this, but for Baghdad and Iraq, the cities in Iraq, are the epicenter for one of the greatest conflicts within Islam between the Sunnis and Shias. I mean, the two family factions that
well, it's all over the succession, wasn't it?
It's all over succession. So I mean, you have one of the greatest battles within Islam, which created these two factions, occurred within Iraq, and it still is an undercurrent that you see in the conflict between those communities and the mistrust.
Well, it's more than an undercurrent there.
It's
on
pretty
the
big.
Larger stage, Saudi Arabia is against Iran for precisely that reason.
Right, and it spills over. But but Iraq is the place where it began, and I don't think that a lot of people know that within the history of what's going on there.
Well, Iraq is really arguably the cradle of civilization.
It is.
And certainly it's Babylon of the Bible, the Euphrates. And the drying up of Euphrates at the end of time, it resonates on every level, from history, theology, prophecy.
Yeah, we work with a Kurdish Muslim leader who is very interested in, because it's this breadbasket of the Middle East and the world, trying to bring all the different communities back together and really focus on the agriculture and on building a more peaceful garden and a peaceful community.
The Hanging Gardens of Babylon type.
Yes, yeah, well.
No, but it's very good that they're rebuilding a community, rebuilding trust, and not putting aside religion. You're not trying to say that religion's immaterial to people at all, are you?
No, I think that's what we realize, is that in order to really address these root causes of the conflict, you have to address the religious dimension of it. And so it's exciting to see what's happening in Kurdistan today, where they're beginning to have an educational curriculum that incorporates the religious diversity of the country. And as Hardwired, we're working there to help them implement it in a way that teaches children to value religious freedom, so that we can see generations that will grow up not with the animosities and the tensions of the past, but that will grow up with a new vision for the future that incorporates everyone.
Whenever you speak about holy war, it's worth remembering that there's an inbuilt contradiction. I believe unless you're talking about God's strange and final act, in dealing with evil. There's no such thing as a holy or sanctified war. That said, throughout the ages, and certainly during the Crusades, many people went to war with a holy sense of fulfillment and that they had a contract with God to wipe out their enemies. Today in the Middle East, we're seeing a manifestation of this idea of killing in the name of God. It is not right. It is not the way forward for humankind. It is certainly nothing to do with protecting man's innate right and calling to worship God in the way that his conscience requires. For Liberty Insider, this is Lincoln Steed.